Beneath the vaulted hush of Westminster Abbey, Miss Eliza Harrow stood where whispers gathered like moths to candlelight. Silk skirts brushed the stone in cautious arcs. Lace fans fluttered like nervous birds, concealing smiles sharpened by memory. Once promised, now pitted, she lowered her gaze and bore their scrutiny with a stillness mistaken for weakness. The organ's final note trembled overhead, then dissolved into a hush that felt heavier than sound. Rain threaded the stained glass with silver, echoing the tremor in her breath. She had chosen to attend because absence would have been interpreted as guilt, and presence, she believed, might yet resemble courage. Women who had once sought her company now studied the embroidery at her cuffs as if it were a curiosity displayed behind glass. Gentlemen adjusted their gloves and looked through her, polite as winter. A murmur passed from pew to pew, a tide of recollection no one wished to name. Eliza felt the familiar weight of it pressing between her shoulders. The story told about her without her voice, the narrative concluded without her consent. She stood with perfect posture, hands folded, every line of her figure declaring composure. It was the only armor permitted to a woman who had already been discussed too thoroughly. At the altar, the bride's veil shimmered like spun frost, and beside her stood the man Eliza had once expected to marry. He did not look at Eliza, which was its own declaration. The congregation admired the couple with relief, as though witnessing a correction made to an earlier error. Eliza watched the ceremony through a haze of discipline, refusing to blink away the sting that threatened to betray her. If she wept, they would remember her tears longer than they remembered the vows. If she faltered, they would call it proof that she had deserved the quiet exile that followed their broken engagement. When the blessing concluded, applause swelled with indecorous enthusiasm. Eliza waited for the aisle to clear before moving, careful not to brush against satin or sentiment. She passed beneath arches ribbed like the inside of a shell, her footsteps softened by the echo of 100 departing shoes. Outside, the sky leaned low and gray, as though London itself wished to avoid the spectacle of her departure. A fine rain descended, persistent and unkind, stippling the stone with darkened freckles. She descended the cathedral steps alone. No maid waited with an umbrella, no companion hovered to offer sympathetic chatter. Solitude, she had learned, discouraged conversation more effectively than dignity. The drizzle gathered at the edge of her bonnet and slid in cool threads along her temple. Eliza lifted her chin slightly, an unconscious defiance against the weather and the eyes she could still feel upon her back. She had survived worse than rain and worse than whispers, yet today both seemed to conspire with unusual cruelty. Behind her, laughter spilled from the great doors as guests hurried toward their carriages. A woman's voice floated outward, syrupy with delight, remarking that some invitations were better declined. The words did not name Eliza, but they wrapped around her with unmistakable intent. She paused only once, fingers tightening on the reticule at her wrist, then resumed her measured pace toward the street. She would not run. Running would confirm that the whispers had found their mark. The street beyond the abbey glistened like polished slate. Horses stamped and snorted, their breath fogging the damp air. Drivers shouted to one another over the percussion of rain on leather hoods. Eliza stepped to the edge of the curb, searching for a hired cab, and found none immediately available. A curious stillness settled in her chest, a momentary suspension between humiliation and escape. She wondered, not for the first time, whether silence was a form of surrender or a discipline she had mistaken for strength. Then the rhythm of hooves shifted. A carriage darker than the weather itself rolled forward from the line of vehicles and halted precisely before her. Its lacquered panels bore an aristocratic crest worked in gold so subtle it appeared to gleam from within the wood. The driver did not call out. The horses stood obedient, their harnesses whispering faintly with the rain. Eliza's breath caught, not from recognition, but from the deliberate exactness of the interruption. The carriage door opened from within before the footman could descend. A gloved hand emerged, steady, patient, commanding in its quiet offer. No voice accompanied the gesture, yet the intention was unmistakable. Eliza stared at the hand as though it belonged to an apparition conjured by fatigue. She knew enough of London society to understand that such carriages did not pause for women of uncertain reputation without purpose. Curiosity flared against her caution, bright as a struck match. She lifted her gaze and met the eyes of the man seated inside. His features were composed with an austerity that suggested discipline rather than coldness, though rumor would have named him severe. His dark coat framed a posture of unyielding elegance. His expression held neither pity nor familiarity. He regarded her as one might regard a person whose presence had been expected all along. In that steady look, Eliza felt something unfamiliar, not judgment, not sympathy, but recognition. The rain deepened, blurring the edges of the street into a silver haze. Behind her, the cathedral doors thundered closed, sealing the laughter and music away as if they belonged to another world. Before her, the open carriage waited with impossible patience. Eliza sensed, with startling clarity, that this moment would not permit indecision. To refuse the hand would be to remain where she stood, exposed to the lingering gaze of those who had already decided her story. To accept it would be to step into a narrative she did not yet understand. Her heart beat with a firm, deliberate rhythm that steadied her thoughts. She had spent months enduring what society said about her. Perhaps it was time to discover what one silent stranger intended. Eliza placed her gloved fingers into the offered hand, feeling the warmth through layers of kid leather. The grip was gentle yet certain, guiding her upward without haste. As she crossed the threshold into the shadowed interior, she realized that for the first time that day, the whispers had fallen entirely away. The door closed with a muted finality that sounded, to her startled senses, like the end of something unnamed. The carriage moved with a measured grace through the rain-silvered streets of Mayfair, its interior hushed as a chapel at dusk. Miss Eliza Harrow sat opposite the gentleman whose gloved hand had interrupted her retreat, aware of the faint leather scent and the muted percussion of hooves. He regarded her without intrusion, as though silence were a courtesy he extended deliberately. She studied the disciplined line of his shoulders, the austere composure that neither invited nor denied curiosity. In that quiet, her humiliation seemed to loosen its grip, replaced by a cautious, unwelcome interest in the stranger's intention. He spoke at last, voice low and precise. "You should not walk alone while the world watches, Miss Harrow." The words contained neither pity nor presumption, only a statement shaped like protection. Eliza inclined her head, uncertain how to receive concern that did not trespass upon her dignity. She recognized him then from portraits glimpsed at society gatherings. His Grace, Duke Alastair Ravenshire, reputed for severity and restraint. Rumor painted him as a man immune to sentiment, governed by principles as rigid as the iron gates of his estate. Rain traced the window panes with trembling lines, turning the city into a watercolor of gaslight and shadow. Eliza wondered why such a man would involve himself in the quiet misfortune of a woman whose name circulated in whispers. She resisted the urge to ask, sensing that his reasons would reveal themselves without interrogation. Instead, she answered with the courtesy drilled into her since girlhood. "Your Grace is generous beyond necessity." He met her gaze briefly, and she detected the faintest tightening at the corner of his mouth, as if generosity were a term he did not recognize. They spoke no further until the carriage halted before her modest townhouse. The Duke descended first, extending his hand again with the same deliberate calm. A footman appeared from nowhere, shielding her from the rain with disciplined efficiency. Eliza stepped onto the pavement, aware that neighboring curtains had stirred in curious waves. London thrived on spectacle, and she had been provided a new one. Before she could form a polite farewell, the Duke said, "You will receive a delivery in the morning. I ask that you accept it without hesitation." The carriage departed before she could inquire further, leaving her beneath the soft hiss of rain and a gathering storm of speculation. She entered her home with a mind unsettled by questions she could not voice. Sleep visited her lightly, punctuated by the memory of his steady eyes and the peculiar steadiness of his presence. When dawn filtered through the curtains in pale ribbons, a knock sounded at her door with decisive rhythm. Her maid returned from answering it carrying an arrangement so exquisite it seemed almost unreal. Winter roses, white as first frost, lay bound with a ribbon the color of midnight. Their fragrance filled the small sitting room with a restrained sweetness that felt at odds with her recent sorrow. A card rested among the stems, bearing only the Duke's seal and no written message. Eliza traced the wax impression with a thoughtful finger, understanding that the absence of words was itself intentional. The gift announced nothing, promised nothing, yet declared attention with unmistakable clarity. By afternoon, the whispers had found new life. A neighbor paused mid-conversation to stare openly as Eliza stepped out for air. Two ladies passing by exchanged glances bright with speculation. News traveled in London not through proclamations but through curiosity sharpened by envy. Eliza realized she had exchanged one kind of scrutiny for another, though this new attention felt less like accusation and more like astonishment. The Duke's silent gesture had placed her at the center of a mystery society longed to unravel. The following morning, she encountered him again during a promenade near Hyde Park. He approached without ceremony and fell into step beside her as though it were the most natural arrangement in the world. Passers-by slowed, their interest thinly disguised by exaggerated politeness. Eliza sensed the ripple of awareness spreading outward like rings upon water. The Duke did not touch her, did not offer his arm, yet his proximity formed a shield more formidable than any escort. "You see," he murmured without turning his head, "how quickly the crowd learns new manners when observation is redirected." Eliza allowed herself a small breath of astonished amusement. She had spent months avoiding attention. Now she was walking calmly through its center. The transformation felt less like triumph and more like an unfamiliar equilibrium. She realized with quiet clarity that his presence altered not her reputation but the behavior of those who judged it. They parted without ceremony at the park's edge. Eliza returned home aware that she had crossed some invisible boundary in the eyes of London. She could almost hear the collective calculation taking place behind closed doors. Why would a duke concern himself with a woman so recently diminished? What history existed between them that no one had noticed? The questions fluttered through society like startled birds, unsettled and restless. That evening, a formal envelope arrived bearing the duke's crest once more. The paper was thick, the ink precise, the message restrained. He requested the pleasure of her company for tea at his private estate, phrased with impeccable courtesy and an undertone of expectation. Eliza read the lines twice, aware that acceptance would propel the rumors into something bolder than speculation. Declining would return her to the smallness she had begun to outgrow. She held the letter to the lamplight, watching the flame glow through the fibers. The Duke's gestures were measured, deliberate, and utterly devoid of impropriety. Yet each one shifted the ground beneath her feet, asking her to step forward rather than retreat. Eliza felt the first stirring of something she had not permitted herself since her engagement ended. A fragile, reluctant curiosity about what her life might look like beyond endurance. She set the letter upon the desk and gazed out the window at the dimming street. The world beyond the glass continued with its ordinary rhythm, unaware that her quiet existence had been interrupted by a man whose intentions remained cloaked in restraint. She sensed that accepting his invitation would not merely answer society's questions but confront her own. And for the first time, the prospect of being seen did not feel like a threat, but a possibility waiting patiently to unfold. The road unfurled in damp ribbons as the carriage carried Miss Eliza Harrow beyond London's grey breath toward the quiet fields of Kent. Hedgerows blurred past like pages turned too quickly, and the sky hung low with a patient, silver light. She sat composed, hands folded, acutely aware that acceptance of the Duke's invitation had shifted her from speculation into intention. Curiosity pressed against her composure, equal parts caution and anticipation. Each mile seemed to carry her farther from the version of herself defined by whispers and closer to something uncharted. The Duke's estate emerged from the countryside with restrained grandeur, stone warmed by age rather than ornament. Windows rose tall and narrow, reflecting the sky like thoughtful eyes. A footman assisted her down with practiced courtesy, and Eliza felt the peculiar stillness of a place governed by order rather than spectacle. Inside, the air carried the faint scent of beeswax and old paper. Firelight moved along the corridor walls in patient amber strokes, guiding her toward a library that felt more sanctuary than room. Duke Alistair Ravensshire stood near the hearth, his posture composed, his expression unreadable yet attentive. He bowed with precise respect, as though greeting an equal rather than a guest of uncertain standing. "Miss Harrow, you honor my home," he said quietly. The warmth of the fire softened the edges of his severity, and she sensed a private tension beneath his restraint. Eliza returned the courtesy, aware that the space between them held a conversation not yet spoken. They sat opposite one another with a small table between them bearing tea untouched. Rain tapped gently against the windows, enclosing them in a hush that invited honesty. Eliza realized that here, removed from London's constant observation, her silence did not feel like defense but like space waiting to be filled. The Duke regarded her with the same steady recognition he had offered in the carriage, as though he had anticipated this moment long before she had. She felt seen without being examined, acknowledged without being measured. "I witnessed the wedding," he began, voice low and deliberate. The confession settled between them with unexpected weight. Eliza's breath caught, surprised not by the admission but by the emotion beneath it. He continued, "I watched how they spoke of you without speaking to you. Your silence angered me more than their cruelty." She studied his face, searching for mockery and finding none. His expression held a restrained indignation that felt almost personal. She lowered her gaze, unsure how to receive such candor. "Silence was the only dignity left to me," she replied softly. The Duke leaned forward slightly, as though the words demanded closer attention. "You mistook restraint for surrender, Miss Harrow," he said. "I recognized it as strength the world did not deserve." The fire snapped behind him, punctuating the quiet with a brief, bright sound. Eliza felt something fragile within her shift, like ice beginning to loosen beneath spring light. He rose and crossed to a shelf lined with volumes worn by use rather than display. Drawing one free, he returned and placed it gently upon the table between them. "I have observed you for years," he admitted without embarrassment. "At lectures, at gatherings, in rooms where others sought admiration, you sought understanding." Eliza stared at the book, unsettled by the idea that she had been known without realizing it. The revelation felt both intimate and disarming. "You noticed me," she said, more to herself than to him. He inclined his head. "I noticed how rarely others did." The statement carried no flattery, only a quiet truth that resonated deeper than praise. Eliza felt the familiar ache of being overlooked soften into something almost luminous. For the first time since her engagement dissolved, she sensed that her existence had not been reduced to a cautionary tale. Someone had been watching not her fall, but her endurance. Rain deepened against the glass, tracing restless paths downward. The Duke resumed his seat, his gaze never wavering from hers. "I despise injustice performed politely," he said, the words edged with contained force. "And I despise the manner in which society erases a woman while congratulating itself for civility." Eliza felt a quiet heat rise within her chest, not from anger but from recognition. His indignation mirrored feelings she had never dared articulate. Silence returned, but it was no longer empty. It pulsed with the awareness of mutual understanding. Eliza realized that her caution had softened into trust without her permission. She studied the lines of his face and saw not severity but discipline shaped by conviction. "Why involve yourself in my misfortune?" she asked gently. The Duke's answer came without hesitation. "Because it should not have been yours to bear alone." The simplicity of the statement unraveled something tightly wound within her. She felt tears threaten, not from sorrow but from relief. He had not offered rescue, only companionship in a burden unfairly assigned. Eliza understood that this was the first time since her humiliation that someone had addressed her as a person rather than a circumstance. The realization settled over her like warmth after a long chill. The Duke's voice softened further. "Would you allow me to stand beside you where others once refused?" The question carried no urgency, only quiet hope. Eliza looked at him steadily, aware that her answer would alter the course of her life in ways she could not predict. Outside, the rain eased into a gentle whisper, as though the world itself paused to listen. She felt the weight of past whispers recede, replaced by the possibility of a future not defined by them. Her heart beat with a calm certainty she had not known in months. She realized that this invitation was not to scandal, but to partnership. The Duke was not asking to shield her from society, but to challenge it with her. Eliza inhaled slowly, tasting the warmth of the fire and the faint scent of old paper. She sensed that stepping forward now would require more courage than enduring silence ever had. She met his gaze without hesitation. "Yes," she said, the words steady and unadorned. The Duke inclined his head once more, as though acknowledging a pact rather than a favor. In that quiet library, with rain fading into memory, Eliza felt the first true shift in her story since the day it had been taken from her. And as the firelight flickered between them, she understood that this was no longer about surviving whispers, but about deciding what voice she wished the world to hear. Gaslight trembled along the polished facades of Mayfair as carriages queued before the illuminated townhouse, their wheels hissing softly on damp stone. Miss Eliza Harrow descended from the Duke's carriage with a composure that felt newly earned, her gloved fingers resting lightly upon his offered arm. Conversation near the entrance faltered, then resumed with a careful brightness that betrayed its curiosity. She sensed the familiar gaze of society upon her, yet this time it did not press her downward. It circled, wary, measuring the gravity of the man beside her. Duke Alastair Ravenshire moved with unhurried assurance through the foyer, acknowledging hosts and dignitaries with economical courtesy. Crystal chandeliers scattered light across silk gowns and black coats, turning the ballroom into a constellation of restless stars. Eliza felt the warmth of the room wrap around her shoulders, mingling with the faint perfume of lilies and beeswax. Whispers drifted like smoke, too thin to grasp yet impossible to ignore. She realized that the spectacle had shifted from her disgrace to the Duke's intention. They entered the ballroom together, and a subtle hush followed their progress across the floor. Faces that once studied her with veiled pity now arranged themselves into polite admiration. A quartet played near the windows, their melody delicate as falling snow. Eliza's pulse matched the tempo, steady and resolute. The Duke did not speak, yet his presence radiated an authority that altered the room's behavior more effectively than any proclamation. Near the refreshment table, she glimpsed her former fiancé among a cluster of gentlemen. His posture stiffened when he saw her, surprise flaring into something less easily named. Eliza felt no surge of bitterness, only a distant recognition of a chapter already closed. She sensed the Duke register the shift in her breathing without looking at her directly. His arm remained firm, neither possessive nor distant, simply certain. A lady approached with a smile stretched too thin to conceal its calculation. "Miss Harrow, how delightful to see you restored to society's pleasures," she said sweetly. Eliza inclined her head with serene courtesy. Before she could reply, the Duke's voice entered the exchange, calm and unmistakable. "Miss Harrow was never absent from society's worth, madam. Only from its fairness." The lady faltered, retreating with murmured pleasantries that failed to mask her discomfort. The dance began, and the Duke turned to Eliza with quiet intention. "May I?" he asked, though the question felt ceremonial rather than necessary. She placed her hand in his, aware that 100 eyes sharpened in anticipation. They moved onto the floor with measured grace, their steps synchronized by an understanding forged in silence rather than practice. The music wrapped around them, isolating them in a circle of sound and light. As they danced, Eliza felt the room recede into a blur of color and speculation. The Duke's gaze remained steady upon hers, untroubled by the scrutiny surrounding them. "You are not obliged to endure this," he murmured. She answered softly, "I am no longer enduring." The distinction settled between them like a shared secret, lending the dance a gravity beyond performance. For the first time, she felt that society watched not her vulnerability but her resolve. When the music concluded, applause rippled politely across the ballroom. The Duke did not release her hand at once, allowing the moment to extend just beyond propriety. Then, with deliberate calm, he guided her toward the center of the room where conversation clustered thickest. Eliza sensed the shift before it occurred, a gathering stillness as though the air itself prepared to listen. He addressed the host with impeccable courtesy, requesting a moment of attention. Voices dimmed, fans paused mid-flutter, and the quartet lowered their instruments. The Duke's voice carried clearly without strain. "I wish to make known my intention to court Miss Eliza Harrow with the utmost respect and seriousness." The words fell into the silence like stones into a still pond, sending astonishment outward in widening circles. A murmur swelled, then faltered as his gaze swept the room with restrained authority. "I find it curious," he continued evenly, "how quickly society reconsiders the worth of a woman when she is chosen by a man it fears disappointing." No accusation sharpened his tone, yet the rebuke landed with unmistakable force. Eliza felt a warmth rise to her cheeks, not from embarrassment but from the dignity his words restored. Across the room, her former fiancé stepped forward, color draining from his expression. He approached with a stiffness that betrayed his agitation. "Your Grace, a word if you please," he said tightly. The Duke regarded him without hostility, then inclined his head once. "You may address Miss Harrow directly," he replied. "Her voice requires no intermediary." The invitation hung between them with quiet challenge. Eliza met the man she had once loved with calm clarity. He searched her face for traces of the woman he remembered, perhaps hoping to find regret. "I had not expected," he began, faltering. She spared him the struggle with gentle firmness. "Nor had I, sir," she said, her tone composed. "Yet here we are, both altered by what we have learned." The simplicity of her words seemed to unnerve him more than accusation might have. He attempted an apology shaped by habit rather than understanding. Eliza listened without interruption, recognizing the effort yet feeling no need to accept it. Around them, the ballroom remained suspended in attentive silence. She realized that this was the moment she had unconsciously prepared for since the cathedral steps. "I wish you happiness," she said quietly, "but I no longer wish to be measured by what we once were." The Duke stood slightly behind her, saying nothing, offering no rescue from the exchange. His restraint conveyed a profound trust in her ability to speak for herself. Eliza felt the weight of old whispers dissolve, replaced by the steady clarity of her own voice. The former fiancé bowed stiffly and withdrew, leaving a wake of unsettled gazes in his path. Conversation resumed with cautious vigor, though the room's atmosphere had irrevocably changed. Eliza sensed that she had crossed a threshold not merely of reputation but of self-possession. The Duke offered his arm once more, and she accepted with quiet gratitude. Together, they moved toward the terrace doors where cool night air waited beyond the glow of chandeliers. As they stepped outside, the sounds of the ball softened into a distant murmur. The city stretched before them in a tapestry of lamplight and shadow, rain-slicked and luminous. Eliza drew a steady breath, aware that something within her had settled into place. She turned to the Duke, meeting his gaze without hesitation. "You did not give me a voice tonight," she said softly. "You reminded the world that I already had one." He regarded her with an expression touched by rare warmth. "Then let the world grow accustomed to hearing it," he replied. And in the quiet that followed, Eliza understood that the greatest scandal of the evening was not his declaration, but her decision never again to stand silent when dignity called her to speak. Rain silvered the terrace stones beyond the ballroom, softening the gaslight into halos that trembled in the night air of Mayfair. Miss Eliza Harrow stood beneath the eaves, her breath steady, the music inside reduced to a distant murmur. Duke Alistair Ravensshire remained beside her without speaking, as though guarding the quiet she had finally claimed. The evening's declaration still rippled through the house behind them, altering conversations in rooms she could no longer see. She felt neither triumph nor fear, only a lucid calm that surprised her with its depth. Footsteps approached across the terrace, hesitant yet determined. Her former fiancé emerged from the light, hat in hand, his expression stripped of the confidence that had once defined him. He halted at a respectful distance, eyes searching Eliza's face for permission he no longer presumed. The Duke did not move, offering no interruption and no encouragement, his composure a testament to trust. Eliza realized this was the final echo of a chapter that had governed her silence for too long. "I owe you words I did not have the courage to speak before," the gentleman began, voice subdued by humility. Eliza listened with a patience born not of obligation but of closure. He spoke of confusion, of pressure, of the folly of allowing society's expectations to outweigh private loyalty. His apology unfolded carefully, as if he feared any sudden motion might shatter the fragile honesty he had found too late. The rain whispered against the stone between his pauses, filling the spaces his courage could not. When he finished, Eliza regarded him with steady clarity. "I accept that you regret what was done," she said gently, "but I no longer carry the weight of it." The words surprised even her with their simplicity. She felt the truth of them settle into her chest like a final, quiet note. He nodded, relief and sorrow mingling in his expression, then bowed with sincere respect before withdrawing into the night. Silence returned to the terrace, no longer tense but complete. Eliza turned to the Duke, aware that he had witnessed the exchange without claiming any part in it. "Thank you for allowing me to answer for myself," she said softly. He inclined his head, eyes thoughtful in the dim light. "I had no doubt you would," he replied. In that moment, she understood that his greatest gift had not been protection, but fa. They re-entered the ballroom together, greeted now with a different quality of attention. Conversations resumed with cautious admiration, as though society had recalibrated its understanding of her. Eliza sensed the change not in their smiles but in their restraint. No one dared reduce her to rumor while the Duke stood calmly at her side. Yet she knew the true transformation had occurred within her, beyond the reach of any witness. Weeks passed with deliberate quiet. The Duke's courtship unfolded not through spectacle but through presence. Morning rides through the mist, shared readings in lamplit rooms, conversations that moved gently from literature to memory without strain. Eliza discovered the discipline beneath his reserve, the compassion that informed his measured speech. He, in turn, learned the strength beneath her composure, the which she had once kept carefully veiled. Their companionship deepened with the ease of two minds accustomed to observation finally meeting in understanding. One evening, as autumn gilded the edges of the countryside near Kent, they walked along a path lined with fading roses. The air carried the faint sweetness of leaves surrendering to the season. Eliza felt a quiet certainty settle over her, as natural as the rhythm of her steps. The Duke paused beneath an arch of branches where the last blossoms clung stubbornly to their stems. "Miss Harrow," he began, voice low but unwavering, "I have stood beside you in silence and in declaration. I would now ask to stand beside you in all the years that follow." He did not kneel. The dignity of his posture required no theatrical gesture. Eliza saw in his eyes the same steady recognition that had first unsettled her on the cathedral steps. She realized that what bound them was not rescue but respect. "Yes," she answered, the word carrying none of the hesitation that had once defined her. The simplicity of it felt like a bell struck cleanly in still air. He took her hands gently as though acknowledging a promise already understood. In that quiet exchange, Eliza felt the last remnants of her former humiliation dissolve into memory. She was no longer the woman society had discussed. She was the woman who had chosen her future. Their wedding occurred months later in restrained elegance, attended by those who had learned at last the limits of their judgment. Light filtered through tall windows, warming the polished wood with patient gold. Eliza walked the aisle with unhurried grace, aware that no whisper followed her now. When the Duke took her hand, the gesture felt less like possession than partnership. Vows spoken in measured tones bound them not through spectacle, but through intention. As they stepped into their carriage afterward, the city greeted them with the ordinary rhythm of wheels and distant voices. Eliza watched the streets pass by with a serenity she had never known. She realized that dignity, once defended so fiercely, now required no defense at all. It existed quietly, anchored by the life she had chosen. That evening at their estate, she stood by a window overlooking the darkening gardens. The Duke joined her, his presence as familiar as the firelight behind them. "Do you miss the silence?" he asked gently. Eliza considered the question with thoughtful care. "I do not miss being unheard," she replied. He smiled faintly, understanding without need for further explanation. Outside, the first stars emerged in the velvet sky, steady and unassuming. Eliza felt a deep contentment settle within her, not loud or triumphant, but enduring. She understood now that the Duke had not stolen her silence as the whispers once suggested. He had stood where silence suffered and made the world tremble long enough for her voice to rise. And as she turned toward the future beside him, she knew that the greatest power she possessed was not in being rescued, but in being recognized.